Chalcis. He is said to have died of a stomach illness, though one source claims he committed suicide by drinking aconite, a poisonous extract made from wolfsbane. In those days, this was sometimes used as a medicament, which suggests to me an accidental overdose or self-administered euthanasia rather than straight suicide. But it's possible that his bitter disappointment at losing the Lyceum brought him to the point where he no longer considered life worth living. Aristotle's will begins with the immortal words, "All will be well," but in case anything should happen, it goes on to outline instructions for the care of his children and the granting of freedom to his slaves. He then informs his executor that if Herpyllis wishes to marry again, she should be given to someone not unworthy. The author of this document comes through as an essentially prosaic, decent man, his character utterly unwarped by being the vehicle of supreme genius. He ends his will by requesting that part of the money he leaves be used to erect life-sized statues of Zeus and Athena in Stagira. I detected no signs of these statues when I finally arrived at the scattered, rain-swept stones of ancient Stagira during the tail end of a thunderstorm on that unfortunate afternoon several years ago in Greece. As I blundered about over the god-forsaken hillside, I found myself reminded of Aristotle's insight into the nature of comedy. According to him, the ludicrous was merely a form of painless ugliness. Numb with cold, and not a pretty sight, I realized there was still some mileage left in Aristotle's thought, at least where the ludicrous was concerned. Aristotle's originality remains unparalleled in the history of philosophy. Despite this, he suffered from the oldest philosophical delusion of them all, one that remains with us to this day. According to Cicero, Aristotle criticized the philosophers who preceded him for thinking that their intellectual effort had been sufficient to complete philosophy once and for all. He was convinced they must have been either very stupid or very conceited to think such a thing. However, as philosophy had made such great strides in just a few years, he was confident that it would soon be brought to a successful conclusion.
This book is continued on Disc 2.
Aristotle in 90 Minutes by Paul Strathern, continued.
Disc 2.
According to Cicero, Aristotle criticized the philosophers who preceded him for thinking that their intellectual effort had been sufficient to complete philosophy once and for all. He was convinced they must have been either very stupid or very conceited to think such a thing. However, as philosophy had made such great strides in just a few years, he was confident that it would soon be brought to a successful conclusion. Afterward. When Aristotle was forced to flee Athens in 323 BC, he left the Lyceum in charge of Theophrastus. According to one source, Theophrastus had fallen in love with Aristotle's son, who had been his pupil, but Aristotle evidently didn't consider that this time-honored occupational hazard disqualified his successor. Theophrastus ensured the continuity of the Lyceum after the departure of its founder, and its peripatetic school of philosophers soon began living up to their name by wandering throughout the classical world, spreading Aristotelian philosophy wherever they went. Yet it was some 3 centuries after the death of Aristotle before his works were gathered in the form we know them today. Aristotle's works can be divided into 2 groups, those he wrote for publication and his lecture notes at the Lyceum, which were not intended for publication. Inevitably, all the former have been lost, and the only works of Aristotle that have come down to us are the latter. These were originally in fragmented form and covered hundreds of scrolls. They were organized into various distinct works by Andronicus of Rhodes, who was the last head of the Lyceum. It is to Andronicus that we owe the word metaphysics, the title he gave to a group of Aristotle's works. These originally had no title and merely followed those on physics. Thus, Andronicus simply labelled them after physics, which in ancient Greek is metaphysics. The works in this section consisted of Aristotle's treatises on ontology, the nature and relations of being, and the ultimate nature of things. This subject quickly became identified with the label that had been attached to these works, metaphysics. So this word, which through the centuries has become synonymous with philosophy itself, originally had nothing to do with the philosophy it described. Just like philosophy itself, it began with a mistake and has continued to flourish as such ever since. During the classical era, Aristotle was not regarded as one of the great Greek philosophers, on a par with the likes of Socrates or Plato. In Roman times, Aristotle was acknowledged as the great logician, but his other philosophy was largely eclipsed by, or absorbed into, the evolving Neoplatonism, and over the centuries this was in turn largely absorbed into Christianity. Christian thinkers quickly recognized the usefulness of Aristotle's logic. Thus, Aristotle now came into his own as the supreme authority for philosophical method. Aristotelian logic was to remain the basis of sound theological debate throughout the Middle Ages. Ambitious monastic intellectuals indulged in nitpicking logical argument, the finest minds using this expertise to hunt out heresies. Aristotle's theologically unobjectionable logic thus became an integral part of the Christian canon. Yet parallel to this European Christian development of Aristotle's thought was another, equally important Eastern development, which was eventually to have a profound effect on medieval Europe. During the early centuries of the first millennium AD, the body of Aristotle's work remained lost to the Western world. Only in the Middle East did scholars continue to study the full range of his philosophy. The 7th century saw the rise of Islam, followed by widespread Arabic conquest throughout the Middle East. Islamic intellectuals quickly recognized the merits of Aristotle's works, discerning in them no conflict with their religious faith, and began interpreting them for their own purposes. Aristotle's teachings were soon absorbed to the point where almost all Islamic philosophy was derived from interpretations of his thought. It was the Arabs who first understood that Aristotle was one of the great philosophers. While the Western world sank into the Dark Ages, the Islamic world continued to develop intellectually. Indicative of this rich heritage are the words we have absorbed from Arabic, such as algebra, alcohol, and alchemy. But greatest of all was their use of Arabic numerals, while in the Western world mathematics remained hamstrung by the use of Roman numerals. Divide LXXXVII by XLIV, using only Roman numerals, and the difficulties of more refined calculation immediately become apparent. Not for nothing is it said that the only Roman who appears in the history of mathematics is the soldier who slew Archimedes. In the East, Aristotelian philosophy was developed by two great Islamic scholars, Abu Aki al-Hussein ibn Abd Allah ibn Sana, fortunately known to us as Avicenna, was born in Persia at the end of the 10th century and emerged as one of the greatest philosopher-scientists of the Islamic world. His voluminous works on medicine were among the finest ever written, noble attempts to lift this subject from the quackery that it has never quite been able to forswear. Avicenna even attempted to remedy what he saw as elements of quackery in the works of Aristotle. He discerned various problems that Aristotle had overlooked, and even gave answers to these problems such as Aristotle might have given had he seen them in the first place. His attempts to render Aristotle's thought more systematic are masterly and tie up many loose ends. Unfortunately, much of Avicenna's work only closed off options that Aristotle had always wished to be left open. Aristotle knew he couldn't know everything. Avicenna felt otherwise. The other great Islamic commentator on Aristotle was Averroes, who lived in 12th century Moorish Spain and became personal physician cum philosopher to the caliphs of Cordoba. Averroes was convinced that philosophy, and in particular the philosophy of Aristotle, was the real way to the truth, that revelations of belief were merely a lower form of arriving at God. Reason was far superior to faith. It would be more than 500 years before such heretical thoughts began to surface in Christian Europe. One day, the Caliph disturbed Averroes by asking him how the heavens had come into existence. The philosopher was forced to confess that he had no answer to this question. Not always a healthy intellectual position to adopt with a Caliph who employs you to answer his questions. Fortunately, the Caliph respected Averroes's honesty and sent him away to find the answer in Aristotle. For the next 30 years, Averroes wrote an endless stream of commentaries and interpretations on Aristotle's work.